Tip number 1 is start at the end. Now, what do we mean by this? You have to have a very defined endpoint for your training. And when you start writing training blocks or programming for yourself or other people, people make the massive mistake of starting with session 1 and then progressing on from there. When you write long-term training blocks, you start at the end. Then you realize, okay, I'm going to need to achieve these numbers. I need to be able to hit these metrics. This is what my second last training session. This is what my second last week of training, third last week of training, fourth last week of training, and you regress back from there. If you're training for very specific goals, you start with that regressive model, and then you kind of bring your start point and your end point together with a reasonable curve of progression in between. So if you have a goal in mind, if you know there's certain numbers you want to hit or certain times you want to run, you start at the end with that goal. You start with then second last training session, third last training session, fourth last training session, and you plan your training block in reverse.
Tip number 2 is be realistic about how long it will actually take to get to that endpoint. So you followed step number 1. You've said, I need to end up here. These are the steps I need to take there. But it's very important, you need to be realistic about how long it will take you to get there. If you're currently at a 170 kilo back squat and you want to squat 200 kilos, you've got, okay, I need to approximately double 190 kilos, possibly double it for 2 sets maybe. And then when you work back, you need to be realistic about how long it will take to actually get to those milestones. So it's one thing to work back from those sections in the program, but filling in the time in between when you will do 170 for 5 and you'll do 180 for triples, do 190 for doubles, it takes a lot longer generally than what you think it will take. Very often people are super ambitious about how long something will take. You might think 6 months, that's a load of training time. But if you're only squatting twice a week and you break that down, realistically, that's only 30 or 40 training sessions over the course of a couple of months. And in that time, progression happens slowly over the course of months. It happens quite fast over a number of years when you look back. But when we're planning these individual training blocks, we need to be pretty realistic about how long these things will take. Now, it's simple or simpler when we look at things like squatting progressions, but if we're looking at improving speed, if we're trying to run a faster 40 or better Broncos or improve our running times, it gets even more complicated because the rate of progression isn't quite as easy to see and it's not quite as easy to plan. So we need to be more realistic. So if you're trying to qualify for something and you need to make a large gain, what can often happen is if you're not realistic enough with the progressions, you'll end up skipping steps or not spending enough time at the correct zones of training and end up rushing training, and ironically even making it longer because you tried to plan for shorter.
Tip number 3 then is make the correct changes. So I had a rugby coach previously who said if we always do what we always did, we'll always get what we always got. And the same holds true for training. If you've just been training for the last 2 years and maybe your squat hasn't progressed as quickly as you wanted, maybe your body composition hasn't changed as well as you wanted, maybe the technical aspects of your lifts aren't changing fast as you'd want them to, or they're not changing in the correct direction. So maybe you're getting more elbow bend now, maybe you're smashing the bar more now, maybe you miss more of those heavier lifts. It's very important before you suddenly go and change everything, you actually take a step back, review what you've done in training and say, okay, these are 2 or 3 elements in my training or 2 or 3 elements in my programming that I think I need to change. I'm going to change one of them first, then I'm going to change 2, then I'm going to change 3. So it's very important as we sit down to make these long-term plans, I don't suddenly throw everything out and try and fix everything at the same time. I will take a systematic approach to how I change things. Let's take, for example, weightlifting technique. Maybe you've been training 3 times per week for the last year and a half, and now suddenly the technical changes that were quite easy to make in the first few months of training take longer. So maybe a cue given by your coach took around 2 months of practicing with that cue for it to really set in. Maybe now you've been using the same cue for the last 6 months or 8 months and you're finding it's not setting in. So maybe you need some more technical practice. And in that case, going from a frequency of 3 times per week to 5 times a week will give you a massive advantage. Much more practice with the barbell, much more specific practice in terms of the snatch and clean and jerk. And then that's a sensible, positive move in the correct direction. What you don't want to do is you don't want to say, okay, now I'm going to go and train 5 times a week. I'm going to change my coach. I'm going to change how I set up for the snatch, and I'm going to change the tempo in my clean pull. Suddenly now we've changed 4 or 5 different aspects of training. It's going to be very difficult to track which of those were positive changes and which of them were negative changes. And it also doesn't give us any valuable data as we move forward into our next training block and into our next few years of training and programming.
Tip number 4 is don't overburden any individual session. So this is a super common mistake a lot of people make for themselves when they're programming for their endeavors. Whether that's if you're a weightlifter or you're a mixed martial artist, you can very often try and put too much emphasis and too much work in one individual training session. So this might be someone trying to fix, like Dara said, all of their technical aspects in one training session. We're trying to do our squatting, we're trying to do our snatching, our clean and jerking, our lower body assistance work, our upper body assistance work. We're trying to fit in multiple variations of pulls, multiple variations of the snatch and the clean and jerk in those individual sessions. And what ends up happening is we don't get any meaningful volume done in all of these exercises, or in enough of them. We'll start off quite high volume and slowly the quality tapers off later. And even if you can do enough volume, you're probably not going to do enough meaningful weight. Maybe if you're a mixed martial artist, you think, okay, I'm in the off season now and I need to do strength work, I need to do power work, I need to do conditioning work, I need to do mobility. And then very often we'll see this conditioning or the circuit style training we often see with martial artists when they go do their training sessions in the gym. Rather than focusing on speed individually, highly specific skill work, rather than focusing on phasic structure of hypertrophy or strength, they try and fit everything in to one training session all year round. And what happens is we just don't get any good quality on any of these individual training sessions. Far better to have shorter, more precise, meaningful training sessions. Take off a little bit of all those sessions you've planned out. If you're planning out your training now for the next couple of months and you're setting out the template for your individual sessions, I guarantee you've probably 20 to 30% too much stuff in each one of those training sessions. So look at it, be realistic. It's always better to underburden, underweight those initial sessions and then slowly add in more if needed. But I'd guarantee you're probably better off hitting more quality on individual, less quantity aspects per training session.
Tip number 5 then is have some stepping stones along the way. So most of us, if we're in a strength sport or a power sport, we're going to have our numbers, whether that be speed numbers, weight numbers, whatever it is. We'll have some KPI or some metric by which we measure success. And that's how we're going to set out our eventual goals. It's really important that we have these stepping stones in between though, and give them the kind of gravitas that they deserve. So in weightlifting, it's really common we might want to hit 100, 120 after a certain amount of training. And that might be your goal for 2024. So I want to snatch 100 kilos. I want to clean and jerk 120. At the moment, you might be snatching 82.5 kilos. You might be clean and jerking 105 kilos. And so a lot of time people will say, I understand it's going to take me around 12 months to get there, or I understand it will take probably 3 blocks of training or 4 blocks of training to get there. When we hit each block of training, it's really important we have clearly defined goals for the end of those. These are our stepping stones to help us eventually achieve the 100, 120, or 120, 150, or 140, 180, whatever it is. It's very important they're clearly defined and we know we're going for them at the end of each of these subsequent training blocks. So all of my 3 training blocks have the goal of hitting 100, 120, but each of them individually should have their numbers assigned to them. Now, this is really easy to visualize in a sport like weightlifting. It's 2 simple numbers. In powerlifting, it's just as easy. We just have our 3 numbers in our total. But this goes across all sports and all domains of physical training. If you're a sprinter, it's very simple. I have a sprint time. But even if you're a field sports athlete and maybe your performance overall might be to win a league or finish at a certain level in your particular league or your league of teams, but you can start looking at your own individual markers. If you play on the wing and you understand speed and acceleration are very important, maybe your 40-yard dash or your 20-meter sprint becomes an important metric for you to measure. If you're playing in the pack, maybe being bigger, being stronger in the gym, all of these things are important to measure. And those stepping stones, those smaller goals along the way, are vitally important, both to ensuring you achieve the eventual success, but also just keeping you on track and letting you know you're moving in the correct direction.
Number 6 is have defined points in your training block, aka know when to call it a day. So this is one that happens very frequently in strength sports specifically. This is kind of for weightlifters and our powerlifters. Other sports have their seasons, so they kind of have this inbuilt cultural stop. But in weightlifting or powerlifting, we very often aren't great at telling ourselves when it's time to call it a day and be objective about when this block needs to end. So this is something that very commonly happens where we'll start off a training block fine, we'll keep progressing, we might have made some mistakes in our exercise selection, maybe in our volume prescription, maybe our intensity movements are all a little bit off. And eventually what happens is we're not actually progressing towards our end goal. We're kind of like hamsters on a hamster wheel, just spinning our wheels. We're doing training, we're getting training done, but we're not really getting there. And what's happening is we're slowly incurring fatigue. So in weightlifting, this will feel like kind of more central nervous system fatigue. This will be a mental fatigue. This will be a speed fatigue in weightlifting. In powerlifters, a lot of you will notice as that kind of joint fatigue or pains. Your bicep will start hurting, your elbow will start hurting, your back is going to start hurting, your hips will start hurting, your knees will start hurting, everything will start hurting, but you're not actually progressing any closer to your goal. So it's really important when we're doing our training and our own training programs that we're very definitive and we're really kind of cutthroat when it comes to calling it the time and calling it the day when we need to say, okay, this training block has been not as productive as I would have liked. I haven't progressed as much as I need to. But what I need to do is make sure I don't waste any more training this year, or I don't waste any 3 or 4 more months spinning my wheels when I'm not making any progress. I need to stop and have an assessment and see what I did wrong, maybe chat to some people, change up the programming, maybe I need to adjust the frequency or whatever it is, and make sure I don't waste any more time training. Because what could eventually happen, and what often does happen, is we kind of overload those tissues and then we end up with something like a catastrophic injury, an acute injury. We end up with some pretty severe tendonitis. Maybe you might get patella tendonitis or quad tendinopathy or something similar, where you've gone too far, you haven't gotten any benefits from the training block, you've ended up wasting extra time in your year of training. Now you've gotten injured, so you've actually quite literally wasted the rest of the year. So you've done a 3-4 month training block, which should have been 2 or 3 months. You've made it 4 or 5 months. Now you've got injured. It's 6 months rehab if you get severe enough, if you've got those micro holes in your tendons, and eventually you've got a whole year of training wasted. Then you've got 6 months to return to shape. And you know, that might sound crazy, but I know a lot of you experienced it. We know plenty of people who've gotten into those positions where they didn't stop when they should have, when they could have called it a day, rest up for a couple of weeks, got back on the horse with a new structure, more appropriate weight selections or volume selection, and made a great year of it. Instead, they've ended up nearly wasting 2 whole years of training.
Tip number 7 then is think in years, not weeks or months or blocks or single competitions. This is very oftentimes advice that's given to youth athletes and developing athletes or people who are new to a sport, but it holds true across all age domains. If you are Masters 6 and you're still competing in a sport, you still need to be thinking in years. You still need to be thinking about this multi-competition cycle rather than thinking about the next 8 weeks, the next 12 weeks, the next competition, or just this year of training. So it's very, very important we have a large, what you might call a 10,000 foot view or a helicopter view of your sporting career. People oftentimes make the mistake of thinking, oh, once I'm in my late 30s, I'm done, or once I hit a certain level of competition, I'm done. It's better if you just plan for permanent and continued progression over the course of your entire life with a sport. For many of us, we'll be lucky enough where we'll be lifting weights or competing in certain sports such as jiu-jitsu for the rest of our lives. As long as we are physically able to go and train, we'll be able to train. It mightn't be the same level of athleticism, mightn't be the same level of mobility or same level of intensity with those performances, but we're going to be able to train for a very, very, very long time. So now, when you're sitting down, you have your notepad in front of you, or maybe your Excel sheet opened up and you're planning this year's training, plan this year's training with a brief look or an eye on what 2025, 26, 27, 2030 looks like, and say, are the decisions I'm making now the most intelligent decisions, the most progressive decisions, and do they lend me being the best, or do they point towards me being the best athlete I can possibly be in 2028, in 2029, in 2030? Because all of us here who are watching these videos hopefully will be physically fit and healthy, ready to go and train on the 8th of January in 2030. So have that broad scale view. This is very, very important when we look at weight class sports. If you are a 16, 17, 18-year-old athlete and maybe you're really holding on to a weight class, or maybe you're 5 kilos above but you know you're guaranteed a medal if you drop down and cut some weight, you really need to be looking at your progression now being a positive move for you in 5 years' time, or a positive move for you in 3 years' time. If you're constantly cutting weight for those competitions and you're constantly holding yourself back from a physical development, you're not going to be the best athlete you can possibly be in 5 years' time, or even next year. This holds the same way if you're a weightlifter, if you're a powerlifter. Maybe you're only 3 years into training or only 4 years into training, you're really holding on to that 85 kilo weight class or whatever it is, but you know in your heart of hearts you probably need to be 10 kilos heavier. Maybe you need to be 10 kilos heavier and also have less body fat. But it's important that when you're looking at these large decisions, these decisions that take many, many years to enact, that you have that broad scale or that long-term view for your progression.
Number 8 is have a plan for when failure happens, when obstacles arise. You're almost certainly going to get injured at some point, whether that's minor or major. You're probably going to fail some weights at some point. You're probably going to have some unexpected life event that crops up during the training block that will stop you. It's very rare, even for professional athletes, that something doesn't come up during a training block. So plan for when they happen, have a contingency for when they happen, not if they happen. It's great to plan out things as expected, but have a little plan B for when things arise, because they don't necessarily mean the end of a training block. There are certain thresholds for when these obstacles arise that they mean you just need to readjust, change the layout of the next couple of sessions or couple of weeks, and you will get back on track, maybe under the same time frame or slightly longer, but it does not mean the end of that training block. So sometimes injuries, of course, will arise where you need to stop. Large obstacles will crop up and they mean you need to take a large amount of time off training, and then you need to restart the training block because you've become detrained. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you'll be sick for a week or two, you readjust for a week or two, and you get back on top of where you were going, and you end up maybe 2 or 3 weeks later than where you would have been initially. So have a plan for when these happen. Maybe that's in the gym, maybe that's on the pitch, maybe that's on the mats, maybe that's on the road where you're running. Have these plans. They don't have to be exactly specific because you can't know what kind of injury you're going to get. If you would, you'd prehab, but have a plan and make it as clearly as possible for when these things happen. So it doesn't mean the end of a training block. It just means you need to readjust. But the more prepared you are, the better you will be when this happens. Have a physical therapist that you like to go see. Have an osteopath you like to go see. Have a contingency plan of how many weeks you'll regress if you have a certain number of days off. Like, for example, when you input in the Seek a Strength app, if you put in a session that you didn't hit or numbers you didn't hit, the app will readjust those volume and those weights for you.
Number 9 then, and our penultimate tip on this list, is pay attention to the accessories. So we all like to write down our squat progressions. We all like to write down the different derivatives, the different complexes we're going to use for snatch and clean and jerk. We all like to have our different numbers we're going to hit at different points throughout the block. But a lot of the time when it comes to our accessory work, particularly some of the more minor accessories, particularly some of the core work or the isometrics we might have to do as that prehab or rehab work, we tend to just write out the exercise we're going to do and not have a planned progression scale for those accessories. It is absolutely vital that we still force progression on our accessories. Obviously, we're not going to push them as hard or as fast as we'll push our main lifts because they are there as an auxiliary to the main lift. But that also means we don't just tread water with the accessories. We don't just keep doing the same bodybuilding work over and over again. We don't just keep doing the same amount of planks or isometric holds for the same times, the same amount of sets and reps that we've done in previous weeks. The progression will be a lot slower. It won't be as extreme. We probably won't push ourselves quite as hard with those accessories, but it's very important we're making positive progress from week to week, from session to session with them. Also, what we need to look at with our accessories is possibly using exercise selection as a form of progression. So at the start of a training block, I might do something like lat pull downs. I might then continue to increase the weight and volume with lat pull downs until I get to the point where I'm very happy with the amount of capacity I have in that exercise. And then as a form of progression, I can go from there to a neutral grip pull-up. I might slowly build the amount of volume I do on that neutral grip pull-up. Then I might go from there to a weighted chin-up. Then from there to a weighted pull-up. It's very, very easy just to keep treading water on the accessories, to feel like you're getting some work done. The very nature of many of our accessory movements and the hypertrophy movements is we get a pretty good pump when we're doing them, and you can keep doing the same sets and reps and with same weight on a bicep curl for a long time and continue to still get a good feeling of having a pump. But if you're an athlete and you want a solid level of both strength and hypertrophy development, you need to ensure you're forcing that progression from week to week.
Number 10 is start now. So don't waste any more time. Don't think any more time about, oh, okay, you'll get to it soon, or you'll just kind of keep doing what you feel like in the gym. Make that plan now and get training now. You would be so surprised if you haven't been training for a while, how quickly a year of training can go by if you're not diligent with what you're doing. If you're just going into the gym, doing sessions, if you kind of have that kind of pretend readout or program in your head where you're like, yeah, on Wednesdays I do clean and jerks or whatever, have a plan, stick to it. You will waste so much of your training time if you don't start planning things and writing them out and having a as close as possible approximation of what you're going to be doing in that gym with sensible progressions. Training time will go by so fast, and while you need to think in years and months, you would be so surprised how quickly months will go by if you haven't been training properly, where you'll make no progress, where you won't have made any tangible improvements in anything, maybe not objectively weight on the bar, but or speed or whatever it is you're trying to improve, but you haven't improved your body comp, you haven't improved your technique, you haven't improved your conditioning or anything in a meaningful fashion because you've been floating on by. And a lot of people spend too much time in the gym doing this when they know better, when they know they should be planning better. So make sure you get that plan done as soon as possible. You'll learn far more and get far more done by doing that plan and having one written than just coasting away through those sessions. A full year of training will pass you by before you know it, and you'll look back and realize you haven't made any progress.
So thanks very much for watching today's video. If you are in the position where you need some programming, you need some intelligent planning of your training, go and check out the Seek Strength app. It costs nothing to download. You can start a free trial. You can have a look at your programs. You can test things out and see what they look like. It has all of myself and Owen's programming logic built into it. It will adjust your loading, your volume, your sets, reps and load as you go throughout the program where needs be. Also, it allows you to pick if you allow the sessions or allow the program to be extended. Maybe you miss a couple of sessions in between. It will lengthen out the length of that training block to give you the best possible effect from training. Also, we have a smart program coach bot that will answer your simple questions for you, and for all your coaching questions and your video feedback, myself and Owen are available through the members feedback stream every week.